The member for Barker is Tony Pasin. He joins us again on FlowFM. And Tony, our topics today, they all seem to start with the letter B. There might be a B word that finds its way in there somehow.
I'll try to keep it clean, but morning to you and your listeners.
Well, let's start with banks, regional banks. Well, they're not regional banks at all. They keep pulling branches out of regional areas. What do you got to say about these? Some of these banks have said they're going to have a moratorium on closures, including at Kingston South East. Some good news, at least on that front.
Well, it is good news, but excuse me if I don't cheer too loudly. Over the last 6 months, the 4 big banks across Australia have closed 92 regional branches. 92 in 6 months. I mean, banking executives, in my view, need to take a good hard look at themselves. They're very quick to, grab a sprig of wattle or, ensure that their advertising material, highlights the stockman or the grain grower. But, when it comes to servicing these communities, they're, as you say, withdrawing services. Thankfully, my Senate colleagues have established in the Rural Regional Affairs and Transport Committee an inquiry into this, which is shining the light on the activities of the large banks, and they've been embarrassed into postponing future closures for a while, but I'm campaigning for something more than that, Ricky. I've written to each of the big banks and I've asked them to tell me which of the branches in my electorate they've closed in the last 5 years, and the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to demand that they reinstate them. These banks are making billions of dollars of profit a year, tens of billions of dollars, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with profitable businesses, but you can't then withdraw services from people who need them, particularly when you enjoy a government guarantee and you've got a really huge responsibility to maintain your social licence.
Yeah, that's a really strong point you make there. We've raised it also on FlowFM. They did get that government guarantee during the global financial crisis, which seems like a blot in the memory since COVID. But they closed these branches, but even there were recommendations from a coalition task force to have these impact assessments by the middle of this year before they closed any future branches. It's hard not to be cynical. They just started shutting branches before they had the extra red tape to comply with.
Yeah, and look, we can have an argument about technically what the government could do in this context, but really what we're doing is saying it offends the Australian consciousness that profitable businesses, and these are super profitable businesses, like I said, tens of billions of dollars, it offends the public consciousness that at the same time that you're enjoying those profits, which, as I said, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, many of our listeners are shareholders in these banks, but at the same time withdrawing services from some of the most marginalised and vulnerable citizens, those two things don't sit well with the Australian people, and I'm hoping that executives understand their moral responsibilities as well as their fiduciary ones.
Well, we'll talk about some more local topics on the subject of mobile black spots. I know there's another funding round being announced. Minister Michelle Rowland spoke with us about this yesterday, but she was unapologetic about this, what they call a targeted funding round, that you got nothing in Barker, and it looks like a lot of Labor electorates got some funding that way.
I've got to say, Ricky, I smell a bit of pork. This is pork barrelling 101, isn't it? I mean, 54 target locations, all of them, or over 70% of them in Labor seats, the remainder in seats that the Labor Party were targeting at the last election. My electorate covers an area the size of Croatia. We have thousands of black spots across the district, communities like Sherlock, communities like Mayup. These are areas that are screaming out for service. They've got community campaigns, community working groups, and yet none of these 54 locations, not one in Barker. I think we all know what's going on here.
Well, Minister Rowland said that her MPs, Labor MPs in opposition, had said we didn't get any money under funding rounds, and so we deserve to get plugged in this targeted funding. I mean, doesn't that set a precedent? The coalition could do the same if they come back to office.
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, I don't accept what Minister Rowland has said in relation to those previous funding programs. But, when coalition members, I think, represent about 93% of the land mass of Australia, and almost none of these mobile phone sites find themselves in that land mass, and ultimately the rollout of mobile phone towers is a product of, geography. Size matters in this context. I think it's just... I think it's really Michelle Rowland, the Labor Party, sticking up the big finger to coalition members, which is fine. But what they don't realise they're doing is they're showing the bird to regional, rural and remote Australians, which is the real tragedy in this.
Moving on from the bird to another B word that people fear in the River Murray communities, buybacks. It doesn't seem like the State Water Minister, Susan Close, or even Federal Water Minister, Tony Pasin, is too worried about that. They're cracking on with recovering 49 gigalitres, admittedly upstream in other states, but they don't seem too shy about talking up buybacks in the South Australian Murray either.
Well, there's a theme developing here, Ricky. They were very coy about talking about buybacks before the last election. They weren't going to, they were going to drop electricity prices, real wages going to go up. All the things they talked about before the election don't seem to be panning out, and so it is true with buybacks. Buybacks are absolutely back on the table. I keep hearing about the 450 gigalitres that must be recovered to in line with the plan, but someone needs to stop Tony Pasin, sit her down with the plan, ask her to read it. The same could be said of Susan Close, because the plan doesn't say 450 gigalitres must be returned. It says in the event that you can do it in a way that doesn't occasion any socio-economic harm, then and only then can you recover the 450, and that's obviously been forgotten. In the South Australian context, 32 gigs is around what we can expect to have taken out of our productive pool. That's the Renmark Irrigation District. Before anyone thinks that this is a Liberal versus Labor spat, I'm wholeheartedly in support of what the Victorian Labor Water Minister is saying. She's saying buybacks kill communities and she doesn't want them. This isn't a Liberal versus Labor thing. This is a irrigation district versus, city do-gooders perspective.
Well, the irony on that one, Tony Pasin, is also the New South Wales Labor shadow spokesperson, who could well be the Water Minister in 5 weeks' time. She said she wants the triple bottom line of socio-economic and environmental harms, avoiding those. She wants that to stay, and she wants buybacks as an absolute last resort. So why is Tony Pasin on the Susan Close page and not on the page of anyone else in the basin?
Because if the pendulum is between the environment and productive agriculture, she finds herself right out on the environmental edge. I mean, that's the reality here. And the great tragedy is, for those of your listeners who perhaps aren't involved in irrigated horticulture and just hear all this and go, this is Tony and the politicians talking gigababble again, understand this. If we remove this water from the productive pool, it is much more likely two things will happen. Your fruit and veg will be more expensive, and you're more likely to be drinking orange juice or eating fruit and vegetables that were grown overseas. Now, both of those are batshit crazy ideas in my view, and we've got such world-leading horticulturalists who do what they do in a way that's perhaps the most efficient from a water saving perspective anywhere in the world. So I'm just hoping that reality mugs Tanya and Susan on this, and I'm so pleased that we've got sensible Labor voices in Victoria and New South Wales.
And we had a recent gathering and we couldn't get enough potatoes for our meal we were having that night because there was a shortage on that. You're predicting there's going to be more of that happens if there's buybacks? Of
course, because one thing you need in a horticultural irrigation business is water. If you don't have water, it don't grow. That's the reality. So if you remove this water from irrigators, then the amount they're able to grow declines. I mean, that's just fundamental truism, which will lead to shortages. So shortages will be filled with containers of fruit and vegetable that come from overseas. And for the remaining product that's grown in Australia, you can expect it to pay an absolute premium for it. I mean, in a time where cost of living is the first, second, third and fourth thing that people want to talk about, I would have thought removing water from the consumptive pool, driving up the cost of fresh fruit and vegetables is the very last thing federal Labor should be doing, and yet it seems to be their fixation.
Now, Tony Pasin, I might have run out of B words and we may be running out of time, but something else Labor didn't promise before the election, as far as I can recall, was touching superannuation. Treasurer Jim Chalmers is talking up the idea that maybe there could be a cap on how much you're allowed to earn in superannuation, and indeed they might repurpose it for some social projects in Australia. Is this the way we need to be going?
No. The reality is if you want people to save for their retirement, You need to give them certainty, and you need to be very, very clear about that. You need to avoid tinkering with rules around superannuation. Again, this theme is building up, isn't it, Ricky? I mean, say one thing before an election, do a very different thing after the election, and nobody, and I mean nobody, can deny that this was a live issue at the time. Of course, the 2019 election was a disaster for Labor because they pursued a retiree tax. We indicated that we had reasonable intelligence telling us that Labor would go after people's super. Anthony Albanese assured Australians that nothing would change in that context post-election. We were just changing the Prime Minister, and yet, within 12 months, Treasurer Chalmers reverting to type is wanting to treat yours and my superannuation as his money. And I read a really good piece today in the newsprint talking about how this is effectively a death duty. When Jim Chalmers is out there saying superannuation shouldn't be an estate planning tool, he's effectively saying that he wants to tax super so that he can effectively capture that revenue when people are transitioning their super from one generation to another.
So I think we have found another B word. The Bill Shorten promises of 2019 were there all along. They're just hiding them in the background. Well,
I have occasion to knock into Bill around the Parliament, and I've got to give him credit for this. At least he was honest with the Australian people. They didn't ultimately support him to be Prime Minister of the country, but he didn't hoodwink his way into government. He didn't say one thing and do another. He was very clear about his policies and plans, and I think the people of Australia are either at the fuel bowser, at the grocery counter, or when they're reading the papers, listening to news on radio stations like yours, are increasingly forming the view that they've got a bit of buyer's remorse about this government. Ricky?
Buyer's remorse, and I think we all need a breather. Tony Pasin.
From the B word.
We swear. Oh, that's bingo, I think. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Cheers. No worries, Ricky. Have fun.